Good morning, everybody. If we haven't met, I always like to give my full name because I really like my name. My name is Laura Jane Grace McLarty. I'm an English teacher at Nunawading Christian College, and I'm going to extend the same opportunity to you that I extend to my students at the start of every academic year. If you notice any spelling mistakes on my slides, please come see me after and I will give you a merit. Merits probably don't mean anything in the context of this church, but if you were at Nunawading Christian College, that would be very exciting. To get started, over the next 5 weeks, we will be taking a journey through 5 holy habits that are based in Scripture and designed to cultivate rhythms and practices that bring us into God's presence and closer to the heart and ministry of Jesus. Many of you might have heard of John Mark Comer, the author of the book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. He also wrote a book and created a video study series called Practicing the Way that outlines and unpacks a framework that we can use to meaningfully, effectively, and intentionally follow the way of Jesus, who is himself the way, the truth, and the life. The framework is based around 3 central goals from apprenticeship under a rabbi, particularly in first century Israel. I pressed the wrong button. Did I? It'll come up at some point. I'm going to tell you about them and hopefully they'll pop up. Number 1, the first goal was to be, there we go, awesome, thank you so much, team. To be with your rabbi. People who would be training under a rabbi or apprenticing under a rabbi would leave their family and village and they would be with the rabbi 24/7. They would walk with them, they would eat with them, they would do everything together. Secondly, to become like your rabbi. Obviously, if you're spending a lot of time with someone, you're going to become like them in one way or another. Being with your rabbi would help you to pick up on their mannerisms, their figures of speech, their analogies, and they would become familiar to you and you would become like them. And thirdly, to do as your rabbi did. You would apprentice under a rabbi with the goal of eventually becoming a rabbi yourself. And you would be sent off by the rabbi to go and make disciples. Each of the holy habits that we'll be looking at over these 5 weeks connect with one or more of these goals. One of the things that I really appreciate about this framework is that it focuses on incorporating our relationship with Jesus into every part of our lives. It's about relationship over religion. Today, I will be sharing with you some of my findings and reflections on our first holy habit, which is silence and solitude. By no means have I got this practice nailed down, and this is one that I struggle with, despite the fact that I'm an introvert who is very content in her own company. My hope is that today I can share some insights and prompts with you so that you can prayerfully consider how God might be prompting you to seek or create quiet moments in which you can draw closer to him. On the 4th Tuesday of November in 1953, millions of Americans sat down around dining tables to share Thanksgiving dinner. C.A. Swanson and Sons was one of the companies that helped to make this happen by distributing food products. Not long after Thanksgiving, however, the higher-ups at C.A. Swanson and Sons were likely not particularly thankful to learn that their company had made what the Smithsonian magazine later called a colossal miscalculation. They were left with 10 refrigerated railroad cars filled to the brim with 260 tons, or the equivalent of 235,868 kilos of leftover frozen turkey. The cooling system on these railroad cars only operated when the engine was on and the train was in motion, so they were forced to do continuous back and forth trips between the Swanson headquarters in Nebraska and the East Coast, which was about 20 hours away, until they could figure out what to do with this gargantuan supply of frozen turkey. Jerry Thomas, who was a University of Nebraska graduate with a business degree, at this time was a few years into his job as a $200 a month salesman for C.A. Swanson and Sons. He had heard about this dilemma on a sales trip to Pittsburgh, and he was at the time flying with Pan American Airlines, who were experimenting with the idea of being able to provide warm food on their flights by using a single compartment tray with foil. It was revolutionary back then, I'm telling you. He asked if he could borrow the tray, and he stuck it into the pocket of his overcoat. I hope he cleaned it first. Drawing upon his experience in army mess halls, as well as literally drawing on an envelope, he came up with a design for a 3-compartment tray that he presented to Clark and Gilbert Swanson. Thomas had the idea to add the frozen turkey to these tinfoil trays alongside other holiday staples like cornbread stuffing and sweet potatoes, and then they could all be heated together in the oven, and thus the humble TV dinner was born. In the 1950s, TV dinners were a roaring success because they allowed people to buy in bulk, freeze their meals, and prepare dinner for their family while ticking off their endless checklist of to-dos. This new technology aligned with humanity's desire to be faster, more efficient, and to set aside resources that could be used later with minimal effort. Like the humble TV dinner, much of our development of technology and industry throughout history has been to that same end. How can we go faster, work smarter, and be less inconvenienced? How can we make our lives a frictionless experience where we glide from one thing to the next seamlessly without interruption? And to what end? Now that we have microwaves, air fryers, self-driving cars, generative artificial intelligence, robot vacuum cleaners, and the internet at our fingertips, how are we using all of this hard-earned extra time? Surely we are more intelligent, informed, efficient, and productive than ever. An online survey conducted by YouGov in 2025 found that of 1,106 US citizens, 63% watch TV while they eat dinner. Depending on their age, between 24% and 42% use their phone while eating dinner, and 24% listen to music or podcasts while eating dinner. Though our meals of choice may differ, the concept of the TV dinner is certainly still alive and well in 2025. And this doesn't just relate to eating a meal while consuming content. The idea I'm getting at is that it is getting increasingly more difficult in our modern world to do one thing at a time, let alone to stop, come to quiet, and just be able to exist in God's presence. How many of us approach our time with God like a TV dinner? How many of us only ever send up a quick prayer while we're rushing on to the next thing, but never stop to offer God our full attention? Dr. Anna Lemke, who is the professor and medical director of addiction medicine at Stanford University, suggests that in our spiral into joy-seeking abyss, we are forever interrupting ourselves. We have instant access to entertainment, communication, and information in a way that is so normalized that terms like, I don't know if you've heard these ones, doomscrolling, bed rotting, and brain rot have become part of the modern vernacular. Now, for those of you who haven't heard these words, doomscrolling, to spend excessive time online scrolling through news or other content that makes one feel sad, anxious, angry, etc. Bed rotting, the practice of spending many hours in bed during the day, often with an electronic device, as an escape from activity or stress. And lastly, brain rot, material of low or addictive quality, typically in online media that preoccupies someone to the point that it affects mental functioning. Any teachers in the room have probably heard that one before. Yeah. These words are often used in a light-hearted, comedic context, but their increasing usage is the proverbial canary in the coal mine. They reveal the casualness with which our modern society approaches our diminishing ability to self-regulate, disengage, and be discerning in the things that we pour our attention and time into. Many of us, myself included, are guilty of using the extra time that we've been given through efficient technology and societal systems to open ourselves up to what author Madeline Ryan calls an endless stream, a city that never sleeps, a Las Vegas that we can hold. We're at a point in history where it is entirely possible to live your entire adult life without a second of unfilled airtime. Cal Newport, author of Digital Minimalism, writes, "It's now possible to completely banish solitude from your life." So if this is where our world is at, is it worth fighting against this current to embed a rhythm of silence and solitude? Is it even possible to do? What does silence and solitude even look like? We live in an age where busy is considered a normal response to someone asking how we are. I think that's pretty apt. Our emotional state is so often that of busyness. As we work our way through this Holy Habits series, we'll be referring back to the practices of Jesus during his ministry to help us develop our apprenticeship to Christ. We see numerous times in the Bible that Jesus withdrew from the immediate demands of ministerial life to intentionally be with God, such as in Matthew 14:13, Mark 1:35, and Luke 5:16, which we'll unpack later. A booklet published by Saddleback Church in California gives a really concise definition of what silence and solitude actually mean. So I'm going to read it for you. It's on the screen. In silence, we abstain from speaking or being around noisy places, while in solitude, we abstain from the company of others. Silence and solitude provide a chance to be still, to stop, and to rest. We practice them to purposefully remove ourselves from the daily demands of life in order to intentionally be with God. One addendum that I'd like to add to this definition is distinguishing between two different types of silence: external and internal. Mother Teresa actually suggested that there should be 5 silences. She says, "Silence is the beautiful fruit of prayer. We must not only learn the silence of the mouth, but also the silence of the heart, the eyes, of the ears, and of the mind, which I call the 5 silences." The silence of the mind, I think, is probably the most difficult to achieve. So I thought we could try it now. I'm going to give you 20 seconds, and I want you to try and sit in silence in your mind. Try to bring your thoughts to quiet, silence that inner voice, and focus on listening. And I'm going to set a timer. Go. How many of you got to 10 seconds and already wished for it to be over? How many of you started to wonder what snacks would be on offer after the program finishes? How many of you counted from 1 to 20 in your heads to realize that I actually set a 24-second timer? It's hard to do, especially if you haven't developed that muscle of bringing your mind to quiet. An emerging field in neuroscience and positive psychology is that of neuroplasticity, the concept that our neural pathways and the tendencies of our brains can be pruned, guided, and reformed much like a plant. My brother James and I had some friends over for dinner last weekend, and we were talking about how modern society and research are finally catching up with some concepts and teachings that have been preserved in scripture for centuries. The idea behind neuroplasticity reminds me a lot of Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 to 4, which says, "Since then you have been raised with Christ, Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Paul here is reminding the Colossians to engage in the rhythm of setting their hearts and minds on things above, reminding them to reroute their old desires and thoughts and to carve new paths that help to align them with the fact that their lives are now hidden with Christ and in God. This is something that requires repetition and intention to cultivate. One of the reasons that many of us might be reluctant to adopt a rhythm of silence and solitude in our lives is that we're concerned about whether it is even possible in the midst of the relentless current of responsibilities and tasks that already take up our time. I acknowledge that this is a very real concern. The important thing to focus on here is that we are aiming for progress over perfection with these habits. We can use the reminder that Paul gave to the Colossians to help us find silence and solitude in the midst of our chaos of our daily lives. Dallas Willard phrases it like this, and I really like this. Soon, our minds will return to God as the needle of a compass constantly returns to the north. Another reason why we might struggle with embedding silence and solitude into our lives is that we view the practice as a religious tick box that takes something away from us, rather than being given an opportunity to enrich our lives through the addition of God's presence in each moment of our day. Adopting silence and solitude does not mean that we need to take on a vow of silence and move to a secluded monastery in the mountains. Though, honestly, that sounds pretty tempting at times. It's more about creating opportunities in our daily lives where we pause on the threshold between our activities and thoughts to re-enter God's presence. When you're brushing your teeth in the morning, waiting for your sibling to get out of the bathroom, getting into your car to drive to work, walking to your next class, loading the dishwasher, waiting for the bus. Where does your heart go? Where does your mind wander? How can you invite God into those small, quiet moments? This brings me to another important reminder. God sees through the facades that seem to work on everybody else. He wants our honesty, our failed attempts, and our humble resolutions to give it another go. Our imperfect and relentless efforts to show up at God's doorstep yet again are more meaningful than elaborate, sporadic displays of devotion, like those that Jesus speaks out against in Matthew chapter 6, verse 5 to 8. He's talking about prayer in particular here. He says, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him." We don't have to enter our time of silence and solitude with everything figured out, with all of the fancy words or with the performative gestures of religion. Oftentimes, we might feel like we need to have our ducks in a row before we can enter into God's presence, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Earlier, I referred to 3 verses that highlight how Jesus himself frequently sought silence and solitude, even in the midst of his busy ministry. If Jesus, the Son of God, sought and prioritized silence and solitude, how much more should we? In Matthew chapter 14, verse 13, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by a boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. And Mark 1:35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. And Luke 5 verse 16, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. In all three of these verses, we read of Jesus withdrawing or abstaining from the company of others to pray or have a time of solitude. The word used here in the original Greek, I don't speak Greek, so apologies if I don't pronounce it 100% perfect, eremos, which is translated a few different ways. We've got desert, wilderness, solitary place, or desolate. In the Gospels, this word eremos, or its similar variations, appear about 48 times. Throughout the Bible, many people found themselves in the literal eremos, the desert, the wilderness, somewhere physically isolated. But they didn't just find themselves there, they sought to find God there too. They listened for his voice, and they could hear it because they found silence in the solitude, quiet in the wilderness. Those people certainly did not have it all together. And the kid's story was perfect. Here I am. I'm going to talk about 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 1 to 19. Elijah has just had this incredibly powerful, literal mountaintop experience with God on Mount Carmel. He was surrounded by these prophets who were shouting to their God. And I actually think it's kind of funny. In verse 27, Elijah actually encourages them to shout even louder because their God can't hear them. In chapter 19, Elijah finds himself in a very different situation to that of being on the top of Mount Carmel. Let's look at verses 3 and 4. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a bush, sat down under it and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." When the mountaintop experience ended, when Elijah was alone in solitude and his world came to quiet, he was afraid. Filled with anxiety and dread, he began to fall apart. Now that Elijah is experiencing solitude and external silence, his mind, heart, and spirit begin to roar with all of these negative perspectives. He has the solitude, he has the external silence, but the internal silence is near impossible for him to achieve at this point. Where does he go with this? To God. He opens the door to God, letting him in to the chaos. Then, in verse 5, he falls asleep. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank, and then lay down again. Elijah brings his internal noise to the feet of his Father, who is always listening. When we bring our noise to God, we are opening our hearts and emptying our worries into his capable hands, allowing him to step in and move powerfully in the situations that are preventing us from resting in his presence. God gives Elijah a snack and allows him to pause and rest. He meets Elijah's needs in a physical sense, but it also helps him to release his internal noise so that he can experience the intimacy and peace that comes with internal silence and solitude. Once Elijah's physical and mental needs are restored, God leads him to Horeb, the mountain of God, where Elijah enters a cave and spends the night. Elijah had solitude. Elijah had silence in an external sense, but it was only after Elijah gave his internal noise to God that he is able to have that internal silence that allows Elijah to listen and for Elijah to be able to discern when God is speaking to him, like Val talked about. 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11 to 13. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. We can be alone in our own company and not experience that intimacy with God. We can be in a quiet, serene place and not experience that intimacy with God. We can be in our prayer spaces in the early morning before our household awakes and not experience intimacy with God. If we are still holding on to our internal noise, our running monologue, our never-ending stream of tasks to complete, our minds will be too full of noise to allow God the space to speak. We risk not being able to hear his quiet whisper. The way that God met Elijah's physical needs once Elijah invited him into his mental turmoil reminds me a bit of something that Jesus taught his disciples when teaching them about prayer. Matthew chapter 6, verse 9 to 13. This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. It's verse 11, which is on the right-hand side at the top, that I want to focus on here. The term daily bread stands in for God's provision in a physical, literal sense, like his provision of bread for Elijah. But as you are likely aware, it can also be applied in a more metaphorical sense to encompass our day-to-day needs that we place in God's hands for us to meet. This analogy of bread and God's provision also reminded me of a story in the Bible that has always intrigued me, so I revisited Exodus chapter 16, when God provided manna from heaven for the Israelites in the desert after coming out of Egypt. Exodus 16, verse 4 to 5. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way, I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. Though God provided manna for his people, some of the Israelites decided they would try to meal prep. So let's pick back up in verse 17. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. The thing that stood out to me here was that God provided exactly the right amount for every single person for that day. However, some of the Israelites tried to take things into their own hands by stocking up on lots of bread to hang on to until tomorrow. How many of us do the same today with our spiritual sustenance? How many of us experience spiritual highs equivalent to the gorgeous herb focaccia from Drum Bakery and then hang on to that bread to keep us going rather than coming to God to receive daily bread that meets our needs each day? How many of us rely on frozen Thanksgiving dinners that we reheat to get us through? This part is the challenge for me, and it might be for you too. Throughout the course of human history, so many things have changed. Imagine meeting someone from thousands of years ago and showing them a microwave, or a 3D printer, or Uber Eats. Some things have changed dramatically over time, but I'd like to suggest there are some things that haven't changed all that much. Any parents or teachers in the congregation this morning likely relate to the times when Jesus saw the crowds of people searching for him and then escaped somewhere quiet for a breather before going out to face them. Or how Elijah felt at his wit's end until God gave him a snack and made him take a good nap. Yes, times have changed in really significant ways that deserve to be acknowledged. Social media, the internet, smartphones, the economy, politics, and so many areas have irrevocably changed the way that our world works and how we experience it. But some things haven't changed. The God who made us, and the way that we will always have a lovesick longing for something that this world can never provide. We can scroll for hours away on social media, continue answering endless emails, and feed into the whitewater rapids of our streams of consciousness, but we will always be left more full of worry, dissatisfaction, and noise. Jesus invited his disciples to be with him, to become like him, and to do as he did. His disciples often looked around to find that Jesus had stepped away, to engage in solitude, to seek external silence so that he could pour out his internal noise before his loving Father. He encourages them to become like him and do as he did, like in Mark chapter 6, verse 30 to 32, after feeding the 5,000. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Jesus invited his disciples into apprenticeship with him, to be with him, to become like him, and to do as he did. The same invitation stands for us today. Jesus is waiting for us to step outside of the external noise, from the attention of others, from the temptation to perform, from the demands of our lives, to meet with him in silence and solitude. He is waiting for us to pour out our internal noise, to bring us to internal quiet, and to help us refocus constantly on him, to help us hear him more clearly. We know we won't always get it right. And in fact, we will often get it wrong. But like Paul writes in Colossians chapter 3, verse 1 to 4, silence and solitude is a way for us to constantly set our hearts and minds on the things above, so that when God whispers, we are ready to hear him.